Hi, Isabel. Can you see me?
Yeah, I actually can see you, which is great. We were trying to test this earlier and we couldn't see each other. Well, thank you for joining me today. Would
Yeah, I'm
you?
excited to talk about this. I know we've been having conversations about it for years, really.
Yeah, totally. So for those of you who are just joining, we're doing this live because we want to talk a little bit about what has been going on in the sort of eco-death realm and like what sustainability looks like and like the different ways that death care has both seen a lot of like really positive developments in sustainability and also like a lot of greenwashing. So yeah, Tanya, do you wanna say anything around like the framing for you?
I think you about covered it, just that we're hoping to touch on the transparency of footprints, and we're going to kind of talk about what that might look like or why we question some things, and maybe talk about some things that we could consider to do in addition to or to do differently to make it more sustainable.
Totally. Um, so yeah, I mean, just to really like jump into it, for those of you who maybe aren't as familiar with the death care world, there's a lot of talk about like different, more eco-friendly disposition options than cremation. Just because cremation is probably if you had to rank all of the different disposition options, and a disposition option is like how you dispose of a body, basically, like cremation, burial, etc. Um, like if you had to rank them in terms of sort of like how eco-friendly they are or not, I would say cremation is probably flame cremation is unambiguously at the top, and then it probably would go like water cremation or alkaline hydrolysis, and then like natural organic reduction, and then maybe traditional burial. Oh, probably traditional burials above alkaline hydrolysis, and then alkaline hydrolysis, NOR, natural organic reduction, or body composting, and then like green burial. Would you kind of agree with that ranking, Tanya?
Yeah, that's usually kind of how it's presented. I think that's typically what I see is like flame cremation, conventional burial, depending on what they're trying to factor
Yeah.
in, are like at the top as far as footprints go. And then it's usually like water cremation, NOR, composting. NOR and composting we'll use interchangeably, or at least I will, because it's natural organic reduction. And then, yeah, green burial tends to be at the bottom, but sometimes, depending on who's presenting the information, NOR will be presented as better than green burial for whatever reasons.
Right. And so that's actually kind of like one thing it would be good for us to talk about today is just like how do we like come up with those assessments? I was actually talking with Sam Perry, who's from the Green Burial Council earlier today, and they were talking about how like they actually got funding a few years ago for a sort of like subcommittee of the Green Burial Council that like talks about of scientists that do some of the like actual testing around like how much carbon is being sequestered, not maybe not testing but like the research around how much carbon is being sequestered and things like that. And so also, are you getting a lot of background noise or no, are you good?
I can hear some, sounds like someone's doing dishes.
Yeah. Okay. Hold on one second, Kristen, would you mind not doing dishes right now? Thank you. Okay. So yeah, basically, like one of the things that really made me think about this is like last year, at South by Southwest, there was like a talk that I went to where people were talking about this, like the tree burial, where you basically will bury somebody and then like plant a tree on top. And there's a lot of people I think who invested in his company, and like part of the difficulty for I think people like us is like educating people about sustainable options is good, but there's also things like that really have no scientific basis because like in those examples like there like people, I mean, if you're familiar with composting, you can't like put a melon rind under a tree and then assume that the tree can just like eat it and it will become bioavailable immediately. Like there is a decomposition process that needs to happen first. And I think there's a similar thing going on with, the mushroom suit, which I think has been sort of broadly like debunked, or like it's a project that's not going on anymore. And partially that was because there was a large like there was this disconnect between like, okay, what actually happens in the ground, right? Like different local environments have different mycelium networks, right? And so you can't just like give a canned sort of like mushroom suit to people. But then you were also saying, Tanya, when we were talking earlier, that there was like also other reasons why that became more popularized. Could you like speak a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so just backing up on sort of like the idea of greenwashing and what we mean by greenwashing, really anything greenwashing can happen across any market, and it's happening in the death market as well. And it's really someone trying to sell something as being more environmentally friendly than maybe it actually is. And so the mushroom suit was kind of one of those things because the creator claimed that it was going to mitigate toxins in the body and in the soil and et cetera, et cetera. And there were questions around not only is it actually doing that and do you have data to prove it, but are you actually possibly causing harm to an ecosystem by introducing fungi that might not be native to that area? And like, could that actually create problems? And then because the designer or creator didn't have any proof of concept, they were still sort of selling them here and there, maybe not promoting them outright. I don't really remember. But then Luke Perry from Beverly Hills 90210 died and wanted to be buried in a mushroom suit, and it kind of went viral. And so they were continuing to sell this product without proof of concept because because it went viral, and so they knew they could make money off of it. And so when we're thinking about products and concepts that seem like they're greenwashing and or kind of gimmicky, where it's like they're trying to solve a problem that doesn't exist, and maybe the mushroom suit's not an example of that, but something like a tree pod could be, where it's like, do we really need to try to put somebody in a giant egg-shaped thing where we have to dig an extra deep hole, where we're gonna have to cram them into a container that it's not a natural position to put a body into? And like, it just, the logistics of it, it's like conceptually it's pretty, but what are you really trying to sell people and why? What's the actual benefit?
Totally. And like I think the Memorial Forest is like another example where like people market. I think there's a big one that just got like, a bunch of funding in like the Berkshires where people will say, "Hey, you can like come and scatter your ashes here and we'll have a memorial tree for you." And like they charge people like $3,000, $4,000 for these things. And you know, I guess I wouldn't say that they're literal scams because they're not like they are actually selling the thing. But like you definitely like don't like most people can scatter most places legally and it's totally fine. But then also like that is uh not good for the trees. Like having ashes like alkaline ashes are also too alkaline for most trees and plant life as well.
Yeah, so you have the issue of like not only it being, so a lot of times the memorial forests try to play on your save the tree mentality of like, we have this land trust, and for thousands of dollars you can have a plaque by a tree or on a tree because you were able to scatter ashes here, and we're going to protect this forest. But there's a lot of ambiguity and questions around like, are you actually protecting that land though? And is a land trust, especially if it's a for-profit land trust, actually the same as something like conservations or preserves?
Hmm. Yeah, totally. And like, one of the things I was talking with Sam earlier about was this notion of like, why aren't more people talking about reusing grave spaces as like the sustainable death care option or whatever? And it is really a question of like it is both not in line with our conception of American individualism. Like this is also like a really American problem. Like a lot of other countries do reuse grave spaces. Like they do that in China, they do that in a lot of European countries. Like I didn't know that the term for that was succession burial. I don't know if you had heard that term before, but that was new to me. I just learned today. Um, and so I would love to see more of a conversation about that. But he was very much like, look, it's also like not the thing that makes money. It is definitely more sustainable, but it's just you make more money not doing that, and we have plenty of space. So like, there's no demand for that yet.
Yeah, well, and it's interesting because one of the arguments for natural organic reduction, because it's basically like a rapid decomposition that sort of mimics green burial, is what they'll say, is that there's not enough space for everybody to be buried.
Hmm.
And my question has been since the get-go, is that actually true? Especially if we were open to reusing grave spaces. And you're right, it really has to do with American culture and Western culture around what is considered desecration of a grave. And if there's consent involved with someone like me saying, I want to be put into the earth and I'm perfectly fine with you using that space again. I don't need to take up space forever. What makes us think that we're entitled to that? And then also, how does that feed into costs of graves at cemeteries because of perpetual care, and all of those layers? And so one of the arguments for natural organic reduction is there's not space, which, okay, in a rural area, or I mean, in an urban area, sure, there might not be a lot of land there for green burials, but they're also oftentimes moving the compost from the NOR out to open spaces. So why not just consider moving a body out to the open space from the get-go?
Mm-hmm. Totally. Yeah, like I'm not somebody who is, a scientist or research in like, I'm just a death care professional who's trying to like figure out how these things work. But in natural organic reduction, like a lot of what when we're trying to figure out like, okay, what is the carbon footprint? Like I have seen at, I think in Colorado a few years ago was like the first natural organic reduction conference, and they were showing slides that were like looking at the carbon sequestered by each of the different disposition methods. And, one of them showed natural organic reduction being super, super high. And part of me is sort of like when I see that data and I'm like, well, there are like so many more carbon inputs when you think about what happens in natural organic reduction. Like basically what happens is, and obviously it's a little bit different for each of the different providers. There's a few different providers on the market right now, but basically you have to cart in biomatter. You have to like actually they put people in this pod with sort of like the greens and the browns, if you're familiar with just normal garden composting, and then they turn them. And then at the very end of the process, they like take that dirt and then they ship it somewhere, like whether it's someone's house or like a conservation burial ground or something like that. And when you just think about all of those inputs, to me, it's sort of like, well, obviously that's a lot more energy being used than digging a hole, especially if you're not using an excavator, just digging a hole and putting someone in the ground. So that's a lot of the questions that have been in my mind when looking at who is presenting us information in that space. And a lot of the data that is being like collected right now is from the providers themselves.
Right. And that's kind of statistics 101. They teach you like who's providing you information, and is the person providing you information benefiting from it financially? Like, I want to be super clear that neither of us, and I don't want to speak for you, but I'm pretty sure like neither of us is against water cremation
Correct.
or composting. That's not
Correct.
what we're saying with today's talk, right? We're saying marketing is designed to evoke an emotional response from us. It goes after our psychology. And because of the state of the earth and the things that are happening and with climate change and all of that, it's easy to sell something to us who are like, everything is on fire. What can I do to help?
Mm-hmm.
And so when we think about, yes, where this data is coming from, you kind of talked about there's all these layers of what the footprint is. And one of those is the carbon sequestration argument. And what you and I noticed, and we asked some people about with some of that data that was being presented, I think there's some confusion around what carbon sequestration is, because sequestering carbon means you are actually pulling carbon out of the atmosphere. You're pulling it out of the air. Whereas when someone like an NOR provider, a composting provider, is saying that their numbers include the carbon that's not emitted into the atmosphere because a flame cremation didn't happen, that doesn't always feel very fair. Because if somebody was to have had composting versus water cremation versus green burial, that's a different comparison between those three, because no matter what, a flame cremation wasn't happening, as opposed to saying, well, we didn't have a flame cremation, so we're sequestering or saving this amount of carbon from going into the atmosphere. And that is different. Yes, you're preventing some from going out, but what does sequestering actually mean if you're not doing something to actually pull carbon out of the air. And really, with composting, the only thing that arguably could maybe help sequester would be the growing of the alfalfa, which is biggest the biggest preference for the nitrogen source in composting right now, but it has its own issues as far as how is it being harvested, how is it being shipped, what is the water footprint and use of it like, because it can be water intensive depending on how it grows. So yeah, is the data being skewed or written in a way that favors the sale of a product or a service?
Totally, totally. And, also talking about like one of the things that the main person who kind of champions natural organic production, Katrina Spade, talks about is like she's a big design person. Like I think she has a degree in architecture, and so she, you know, I think this, and when you're bringing a new product to market, I think this is kind of like what you have to do is like she built this like, beautiful, like shiny new facility, but it's also like, is that then also being put into the calculation of like, if you are using a new facility versus you're like using a warehouse or something that is being repurposed for this process, like, that all needs to kind of like be part of the equation as well. But how do you actually have apples to apples comparisons when you're talking about these different disposition methods? Because the thing that is the issue with traditional burial is not necessarily like, yes, there's some carbon that goes into creating like caskets and stuff like that, but it's mainly the fact that you're, also putting things in the ground like cement and metal and hardwoods that aren't going to decompose for a long time. So like those types of things are different from how much carbon is being used in the process. Like they're two different metrics, right?
Right, and with conventional burial, you have like you could really get into arguments about like, okay, if you're cutting down trees to make caskets, then you're killing the trees that could sequester the carbon, and you're putting these things in the ground that now you've got emissions from the lawn mowers that have to maintain the lawns, and you've got all this equipment that's fueled by fossil fuels, and like you can go on and on. And I think one of the hard things about like NOR composting is that it's kind of nebulous because the providers are so different. So it's like, yes, what is their infrastructure like? What are their vessels like? And then what is their footprint within their facility? So there are some that are, they're using electronic equipment that is tracking the humidity and the temperature, and they're using cremulators to reduce the bone, and they have big ventilation systems for airflow. And so there is a footprint to that. And how then do we as consumers really look at that from a big picture across all providers and from a sustainability standpoint when this all gets to scale? What does it look like if there are actually hundreds of thousands of compostings happening when there is that amount of substrate that actually needs to be used and that amount of electricity that needs to be used to support the facilities?
Right, totally. So I think for me, like the takeaway is more like I would love to see more people. I think that if you like just from a broader like encouraging everyone to be more sustainable standpoint, I think like I would always encourage if you're like going from, which is why I'm actually also really excited about water cremation, is that like if you know you want to do cremation, like and you're just looking for a more sustainable way to do that, I still think that like going down the ladder is always better. Like that, if you're gonna do cremation, do a water cremation, and then you still get ashes and things like that. And if you're going to do a burial, like instead of doing a traditional burial, maybe you could do a green burial, like pushing people to like try to do the more sustainable equivalent of like the thing that they want to do. But I also think that talking about like the price point is really important as well because having a lot of people, it's not even really an option for them to try to do the most sustainable thing because they're just like, look, I want to spend as little as possible on this. Like maybe this was an unexpected death. Maybe they just don't, there's plenty of people who also don't like. I feel like when I talk to a lot of funeral directors, they're like, people are not often bringing up sustainability to me as a factor in their decision making in this process anyway. So it's also like, how do you even just get that to be in people's minds in the first place? But like, if we're thinking about what the accessibility is of these options, like I know where I live in Philadelphia, there's really only two green burial options and in the area, and one of them, the cheaper one, it costs about like $1,000 to be buried there, is filling up because there's a lot of demand. And the more expensive one is, $14,000. And, there's plenty of space there, but like they're soon to be the only green burial option in the Philly area. And like, how do we make sure that there's a lot more accessible options for people to do the sustainable thing?
Yeah, the price conversation is one that I come back to a lot because it's kind of like the green premium, right? Like I totally respect and understand that water crematories and these composting facilities, like they have overhead, they have staff that I like to believe that they're paying well and hopefully are benefiting and taking good care of. But when there's almost like a shaming that can happen in some of the spaces around choosing green options. What do you expect from people when a cremation is $1,500, but a water cremation is 2,500 or $3,000, which is double the price, or a composting like in Colorado, you're looking at least $8,000. Some of the green burial cemeteries here that are hybrid, you could be looking at $10,000. We have a burial preserve, the only actual preserve, burial preserve here in Colorado. And I think right now it's like in the $2,000 to $3,000 range. So it's not much higher than composting. And yeah, of course, $1,000 plot price for green burial in Philly would probably fill up soon because, like, yeah. So if we can figure out how to make the prices more accessible, that's going to be a pretty big deal. And then my wondering around that is like, again, if we're able to get more people accessing it, what does that look like for the actual footprint of carting in a bunch of alfalfa? Or even with water cremation, the tanks can use 200 to 300 gallons of water for one cremation. And in places where there's water scarcity, in places where, I've heard people say like, oh, it's the same as taking a bath. But like, I don't know what kind of bathtub you have. Like most bathtubs are like 30, 50, maybe 80 gallons. Like 50 gallons is like average. So that's like 6 baths, which you get lost in the weeds about that. But yes, price super duper matters. The language that we use if people can't access price matters. I think there's language being used in like in water cremation. I hear that it's gentle a lot. And I'm like, what does that mean?
Yeah,
Like
what
you're
does that
still
mean?
appealing to somebody's psychology by calling something that is literally reducing a body to its base parts gentle. I don't know what that means to somebody. And so um the other thing, what was I going to say about cost? Pre-need. So I'll hear the argument from people about pre-needs, and they'll be like, well, if people would just plan ahead and buy a pre-need, then they could afford their disposition option that they want, even if it's the more expensive one. And I'm like, you don't work in the populations that I do then, because the people that I know then and work with, like they're deciding between gas in their car and food on their table, and the extra expenditure of like buying a pre-need insurance policy, even if it's only 20, 30, $50 a month, whatever, like that's out of reach for a lot of folks. So yeah, accessibility is a big piece of this.
Totally. I mean, I'm curious, what do you think, are there things that you think that we could be doing about that to try to bring prices down for people?
I don't know. And I think so there's talks about things like supply and demand, and like I think capitalism is a big part of the issue, right? Like the world that we live in, like the people at water crematories, the people at NOR facilities, again, they have staff. They need to pay their staff. Hopefully they're paying their staff well. They have overhead. They live in the same systems. They're paying for their space. They're doing all the things. And so it's sort of like I feel like it's really a systemic issue, and it brings me back to the idea of public cemeteries,
Mhm.
because when we talk about could reusing grave spaces be an option for, you know, not having to do something like NOR that requires such heavy inputs on the substrates and organic matter and water used to grow those things and whatnot. There are countries that have public cemeteries and it's free to be buried there. And so if we could combine something like land conservation or preservation with public cemeteries with reused grave spaces where every 10, 20 years they're recycling those, and it's all sort of like a state or government run type program that protects land and gives people access to disposition. That's like one thing that I sort of dream about. But I don't have the answers. I don't know.
That would be super cool. But most cemeteries are already nonprofits, right?
No,
Is that not true?
I wish. That is not true.
I
No.
Oh, because I was told by someone, maybe I don't know if that was just like completely not true, that most cemeteries are either, if they're not a religious cemetery, they have to be incorporated as a 501(c)(3).
That, that is definitely something that I would need to look into, but I have never heard that. And I think that's one of the issues around why there can be such high prices in some of these places. And then there's the startup cost that's a barrier for people who even want to start something like a green burial cemetery. One, they're looking at jurisdictional regulations. And then two, you have to have a perpetual care fund because this idea is that you have to like maintain these burial grounds. But if you baked that into something like a public space where the land is already being cared for through public use funds, like certain parks and whatnot would be, like, could that just be, instead of having to have like a perpetual care fund, could it all just kind of be public cemetery space? And maybe diving deeper into some of the places where they do have the public cemeteries is a part of it. I know that there's countries in the world where like it's public and so you get it for free, but then if you want the grave for more than 20 years, you can like upgrade to like pay a premium to rent it longer, or try to like keep it. So there's a lot of ways that it could go.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and again, like I'm not against composting. I just don't know what this looks like if we're starting to talk about hundreds of thousands of people doing it. Because we've had people, when it was legal in Colorado, but no one here was offering it, there were funeral homes here who were transporting people to Washington to be composted. And I'm really curious about some of the folks in Washington and Colorado who are doing the composting now, like what percentage of their clientele is from out of state? Because usually they would fly them across the country because it doesn't make sense if you're doing a green option to like drive a car across the country to get somebody there. But there are people who are putting these facilities in their pre-need plans because it's not legal in their states yet and they're having to travel to get it. So we know there's people who want it
Mm-hmm.
and we know that there could be that big boom when there's more accessibility. But then where's all this alfalfa coming from? And one of the things I didn't mention earlier was when we think about things that people might be able to do to like make this even greener, like would it help if these facilities that are using so much electricity for fans and monitoring and just their lights and overhead were on something like a renewable energy source of solar or wind? And then I'm very, very curious. I don't know if you're familiar with the idea of harnessing the gases and the heat that can be put off from composting, but that's actually a thing. It's called, what is it called? Let me look
I have
here
not
because I
heard of
think I
it.
had it noted somewhere.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, you can, it's called compost heat recovery. And
Mm.
so they're using fans and blowers to try to cool the compost and aerate it to keep the process where it needs to be. But there's other places where like you can create energy from the heat and the gas that's coming off of compost. So could they power parts of their facility by actually capturing those heats and gases instead of powering fans to try to keep things cool?
Mm-hmm. Totally. And yeah, I mean, and it always like does really like when people are doing things like flying across the country so that they can do natural organic production, in my mind, I think very obviously then completely outweighs the carbon footprint if that's what the reasons that they were doing it. So like, but like that's why these are really complicated questions is, like if you're even if you're driving like 3 hours to like, go to a green cemetery that, is just the cost of the gas of you going there actually sort of like kind of halfway dis undoing like the benefit that you're doing of actually doing the green burial versus like the traditional burial and things like that. I don't know the numbers, so I don't know the actual answer for that, but it is interesting to like go down that rabbit hole, right?
One of the arguments here that why a plane was a better option than a car trip for that from Colorado to Washington was the plane is going to be going from Colorado to Washington anyway. If you can just get the decedent onto a plane that was going to be flying with all those people that it's already flying with, then you're not really adding to any kind of footprint.
Mm.
Um, as opposed to a car trip, which, yeah, that's kind of a different talk off, right? And we know that not everyone chooses these methods just because, or, because they're the green option. Some people just literally love the, they like nerd out on the science of it, or they just really like the idea of becoming soil or dirt, which that's interesting too, because technically I feel like there's some misinformation or a disconnect there, because these facilities will talk about it being soil. It's not soil, it's compost. And like, you use compost to amend soil, but compost is not
So
soil. And
what
so
yeah, what
if
is the difference basically?
yeah, so if someone, so compost is reduced matter, and you would use the compost and till it into soil to increase the nutrient profile of the soil. But some of the things you can run into with planting directly in compost, this is true of really any compost, is you can have water retention issues, you can have root stability and structural issues, because soil is more compact, it's sturdier for whatever you're growing in it, and compost is nutrient dense. So you can still run into the problems of things like burning vegetation. And so when we think about some of the places, and this has been one of the big criticisms of composting, that they're like, oh, well, we're going to use this to like restore eroded soil areas, and we're going to go out and try to like beef up and enrich the soils there. You can't do that by just dumping it on the ground. You have to actually till it into the soil that's already there and mix it together. Otherwise, you're basically just wasting it and possibly burning the vegetation and stuff that's there. So there's all these layers about like, where are you actually putting it? And then is there a footprint because you have to mechanically till it in, or are they not mechanically tilling it in and they're just kind of dumping it and it's actually not being as beneficial as it could be, and or possibly causing harm?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So
And
oh yeah, the whole calling it soil or calling it dirt, it's not accurate.
right, and then when you're like actually, unless you're going to an actual facility that calls themselves like a conservation burial ground or something along those lines, like, are they also having land practices that are good? Are they using indigenous plants, and like, are they cultivating, not just like a bunch of invasive species and stuff like that? And like, obviously this is way more complex than probably the average person has the time, ability, etc., to like actually understand. But like, that is like, something that like the land stewardship is another factor that really goes into it, that is important if we're going to be talking about, what are we then doing with this soil, right?
Yeah, there's a composting facility in Germany, and I've actually emailed them, but I haven't heard back from them yet. And in Germany, all human remains are required to be buried. And so they have to bury all of their composting remains. The compost has to be buried in the ground. And so it just bewilders me, because it's like, what, I would love the answers about why somebody would choose to be reduced to compost and then still have to go into a grave rather than just go into the grave in general. Like, there's got to be reasons for how they're able to sell the service and why people choose the service, and it's beyond me at this point. And so when we think about that compost use and what we're being marketed about the value that it holds, especially in places like, there are places where the families can't have it, they don't get it, and so you can't go with that. And then if you have to take it to open space, what's being done with it, and is it being done well? And so right now it might not be as much of an issue because there's only a couple states where it's legal, and there's still a lot of volume per decedent. But if we're talking about scaling this, what does that look like when there's literally truckfuls, one after another after another after another, of this compost that has to be put somewhere?
Totally. Yeah. Did you have any other points that you wanted to cover, like, before we wrap up?
Mm, There was one thing I was thinking about with the alfalfa thing. So my husband and
Yeah.
I were like really into exploring aquaponics and hydroponics for a while. We live in Colorado, so it's an arid desert here, and there's water issues. And so we had actually one day thought we were going to be aquaponics farmers. But I wonder if there's the future possibility for something like alfalfa, a water intensive crop, if they are continuing to use that for composting to be grown in a way that's more sustainable. So there's all these questions about like it is an evolving practice. There is still room for growth. What might that look like in the future? And I think for us and why we came on today really is that curiosity and that wondering around like where's the information coming from? Where's this data and these statistics coming from? And what does it all look like when this is being done with hundreds of thousands or millions of people at a time?
Totally. I would absolutely echo that. And obviously, like, this is something that I think us, even as non-experts, but people who are inquiring about these things, it's really important to have these conversations because, this is something that, as far as I can tell, has not really been talked about very much in like this level of depth. I think there are a lot of people who are marketing things that for the most part has just been they've said this is the sustainable thing to do and people are just accepting it. And so like yeah, like kind of like you were saying, I don't mean to be like, oh, like knocking these companies, but I do think that we should have a critical eye towards being like, okay, are there third parties that can verify some of the information that they are putting out there around, the data on how sustainable they are, and are there ways that we can just promote the conversation around like what kinds of disposition options we really want to have in our ideal world? Because like I have always, in all the cities I lived in before I lived in Philly, I used to live in DC, love spending time in the cemeteries. I think it should also just be considered in terms of like what is the way that we can encourage having there be more green spaces that can be sort of third spaces for people to just hang out in, because I've always had been very lucky to live around cemeteries that were very active in the community, in terms of like having people come do goat walks and run and host movie nights and craft fests and things like that. And so I just think that generally like we don't need to just be thinking about it in terms of like what benefit is there to the earth, but also I think the things that are most beneficial to the earth tend to also be the options that are most beneficial for the community as well.
Right. What is that idea of these public, even if it's not a public cemetery, right? What is it?
Yeah.
What does it look like? Or even if it's the compost, like where's the compost going? How accessible are those spaces? What does that look like? Um, and yes, we're both being involved with the NHFA. We're both big on ritual, and there's some providers that are doing really really well with family and pod involvement and bringing in ritual and ceremony and promoting home funerals and like so they're hitting a lot of those points. And I think we're both on the same page too that there's a shift happening overall in death care, and disposition is a part of that. And how do we do it all together? And yeah, I'm all for open spaces that are accessible and recreational and sort of normalized. And um, I'm excited to see what it all ends up being like in the future.
Yeah, same here. Absolutely. All right, well, everyone, thank you so much for coming to our live today. I'll save it so that it's available afterwards, if you want to share it with your friends. But other than that, thank you so much. Thanks, Tanya. Bye.